Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you very much for having me here with you today. No conference about taste without tasting. So I like to ask the two local organizers to pass around a little tasting. And for those of you out there, while this is being passed around, Karen and Lars, you have to do some work here. This is a small piece of seaweed. Everyone take a little piece, keep it until I tell you to eat it. And for those of you out there, go to your kitchen and look for some, maybe a sun-dried tomato, a little bit of soy sauce, maybe some miso, or if you have a ripe tomato, bring it in to your screen and eat it when I tell you how to eat it. And the point of this is that one of the tastes I'm going to tell you about, the fifth taste, umami, is very prominent in these different pieces. So the people here in the room, you're getting the smallest tasting probably you ever had, but it has maybe the more powerful taste. So I'm a physicist, actually theoretical physicist, chemical physicist of training, and I've for quite a number of years been interested in the science of cooking and the science of food and the science behind taste. And I've for a number of years working on developing a new field we call gastrophysics, which is sort of the physical sciences behind gastronomy. And it brings in all sorts of aspects of taste, obviously. And for the last 7 years, I've also been director of National Danish Center for Taste, Taste for Life. Many of the people in the audience, local audience here, have been working within that center. It's a major center covering the whole country. I don't have time to talk much about that. I've for many years been passionate about Japanese cuisine, and my passion of Japanese cuisine and Asian cuisine will sort of transpire what I'm going to tell you today. But to begin with, I'm actually starting on a pessimistic note because we are in an immense crisis at the moment when it comes to climate and working towards a more sustainable world. But I hope during my talk to maybe end on a more optimistic note to describe to you how we, with an understanding of the science behind taste and how people interact with food, we may actually hopefully help solving the crisis. So I've called this talk Taste for Sustainability and the Green Transition. I'm talking about the green transition in the food system. So before I start, let me just indicate to you what I'm talking about. So this is the kind of food we like to eat more of. And obviously we have the plants and think of them as vegetables, but there are also other things there I count as green food, and that's the algae, and it's also the fungus. And so all this stuff is what is not animals. So think of green as something that is not of animal origin. The most important thing you can say about this kind of food stuff, that is, it's on the bottom of the food web. It basically lives off sunlight and whatever nutrients you got in the water or in the soil. None of these need us. We need them. And that's a very important point. So if you ever wonder about how you can eat sustainably, and you hear authorities tell you about this and this and that, and they give you labels and certain climate and imprint of different parts of food. If you can say something for sure, that is, eat at the bottom of the food web, and then you can certainly eat more sustainable. So we know that our food systems are not sustainable, and actually the production of food and the preparation of food, the processing of food, and also wasting food is one of the major stresses on the global systems, both when it comes to climate, the use of water, in particular fresh water, use of land, biodiversity, and then it had screwed up all the basic cycles of the nutrients on the planet when it both comes to phosphorus, carbon, and nitrogen. And about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, there was a major report published, and I'm sure many of you know about this report. It's been highly celebrated, the so-called Lancet Report. I'm not going to go through this in any way, but I'll just indicate to you, make two observations. That is, if you look into this report, you'll find there's one word that is not there. It's taste. Does not exist in the context of food. And the other thing which worries me as a scientist is that one of the most important part of our food systems that produces organic material, that's the algae, which is responsible for 75% of the organic production of the planet, They're not mentioned in this report at all, except for some microalgae, which is not really in the context of bringing food to people. So there are various shortcomings. However, what came out of the report, which was no big surprise, that is, in order to change the system, we had to eat more from the bottom of the food web, we had to eat more green. And we're supposed to eat 300 grams of vegetables and 200 grams of other greens, fruit every day. But the question is, can we eat that much? And this is really what I'm going to address now and try to indicate to you that with basis on understanding aspects of taste, we will be able to eat more of this. So this is the task for me today. That is to tell you how can you negotiate all these wonderful organisms, plants, algae, and fungus from the bottom of the food web, and how can we change our food systems by making these maybe more delicious. So my statement, and this is basically the statement we've been working on all along in Taste for Life. That is, we say, taste always comes first. So you can talk as much as you want about health and calories and nutrition, sustainability and organic. You're not going to move anywhere unless people actually like the taste. And this, of course, a little bit difficult because, and this is also quite often we hear that, well, you talk so much about taste, but you like something and you like something else and you like something else. This is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about taste preferences. I'm going to talk about something much more fundamental, which has to do with our evolutionary path. And also, I'm not going to talk about aspects of social and cooperative aspects of taste. We're going to hear more about that later. But of course, that's extremely important, how these young people or the elderly, how they actually appreciate the food as part of the commensality of the situation. What I'm going to talk about is basic tastes. So we know, or you know, we have 5 basic tastes, out of which all of the tastes are combined. We have sour, sweet, salty, bitter, and umami. And then there's something I like to chip in because that's very important when you want to figure out how you can add interesting taste to the vegetables, and that is what we call kokumi or koku attributes. So now we have all these 5 basic tastes, and there are 2 that are special in this context, and that's sweet, and that is umami. And why is that? So I would claim there's a problem with vegetables. There's a problem with the green. They're not supposed to be eaten. Well, think about it. Plants don't want to be eaten. Neither do animals. But animals, they can run away. So they're not meant to be eaten. So they develop various kind of chemical defense systems. They're bitter. Many of them are bitter. And that's, of course, to scare us away. And also, this is a general trait. And I think that's maybe the most important aspects of what I'm going to tell you. Generally, plants lack sweetness and they lack umami. And the reason why they don't usually are sweet, well, you may say, well, I think carrots are sweet, that's all right. But generally, except for the ripe fruits, they're not sweet. All the sugars are bound in carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have no taste. Also, they don't have umami. Well, some fruits have, for instance, tomatoes. Now, you out there, maybe you found your tomatoes in your kitchen. You're going to eat them a little later. Except for the ripe fruits, plants don't have umami, and that's because the umami compounds, which we'll come back to in a second, the amino acids, they're tied up in proteins, and proteins have no taste. And another reason why plants don't have umami is that they don't have muscles. Muscles and meat-based food have certain compounds that elicit umami, and that plants do not have that. So plants are not supposed to be eaten, only the ripe fruits and the spores and the seeds. They don't have sweetness and umami. They're usually bitter. Now, if you ask ourselves, what do we like, or what do we crave? And even if we have different preferences depending on our food culture and tradition and the way we brought up, grandmother's children and mother's children, mother's kitchen, we crave sweetness and we crave umami, and that's an evolutionary trait. And the reason why we crave sweetness is that it's a sign of calorie. That's been good for survival during evolutionary timescales. So we all like sweet. Maybe Karen said, I don't like that sweet. And you say, well, I don't like that sweet either. But sweet is good for us. And that's, of course, also why it's bad for us now, because we still crave sweetness, even though we don't hang around in the trees and look for fruit any longer. And that's, of course, the trouble nowadays. We have calories, sugars on all shelves. It's very cheap. The other common trait is that we crave umami. And that's because we as species have been meat eaters for at least 2 million years. And in particular, after using fire 1.9 million years ago, when we became chefs, we were cooks, we prepared our food, and meat was an important part of the diet that gave us a lot of energy, fuel to run a big brain, and proteins to our muscles. So this is our craving. Again, some may say, well, I don't like it that umami, but evolutionary trait, evolutionary imprinted in our genes, which doesn't change that much over hundreds of thousands of years, we crave sweet and umami. So that's the trouble. This is what we crave. Plants don't have it. So there you go. So I think it's very important for people who feel guilt about not eating green enough. There's a reason for it, and you have to face it. But once you face it and you know why, there's a solution. So this is what I'm going to tell you about in the remaining part of my time. And there are basically two routes, and you would have guessed what they might have been. One is to add what they're missing, adding sweetness and umami, for instance, to vegetables. And the other one, which is actually the more powerful one, that is to sort of release the inbuilt potential in the plants to lead to sweetness and umami. And I'll give you particular examples of that. But before our tasting, let me just give you a little bit of science. This is the stuff we eat. These are the molecules we eat. Carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and fats. Usually you don't hear much about nucleic acids when it comes to food. They're not very important for nutrition. They're extremely important for taste. And then we have, and then of course there's a lot of water and minerals and stuff. But all these entities, as you can tell, they're big molecules. We don't have receptors that can identify these molecules. They have no taste. Even if you say the fat has taste, well, it doesn't. It has mouthfeel. It has taste in the sense that something is dissolved in the fat, but it's not the fat itself. And all these other things we can't taste because the molecules are too big. They have to be broken down. The carbohydrates, they're full of sugars. We can't taste them. They have to be broken down into individual sugars. And the same with the proteins. They have to be broken down in amino acids or small peptides. And the nucleic acids, think of DNA or RNA, don't have taste, but the individual components of them called nucleotides, they do have taste. And let me just give you an example. This is the last bit of the molecules I'm going to show to you, but it's just in order to introduce the names. And here are some names of amino acids, and one in particular, very important for what I'm going to tell you about. That's glutamic acid, which is one of the more important amino acids in most foodstuff, and in particular the salt of glutamic acid called glutamate. And then for the nucleic acids, some of the components of the nucleic acids that do have taste, what we call the nucleotides, there are three groups in particular: inosinate, guanylate, and adenylate. Inosinate is very prominent in meat and in fish. Guanylate, very prominent, for instance, in fungus, shiitake mushrooms, and adenylate in a lot of different shellfish, but also in ripe tomatoes. And more than 100 years ago in Japan, this Japanese chemist figured out what is in a soup that in Japanese is said to taste umai, miso soup, which is actually made of a seaweed, and it's made of a seaweed called konbu and some fish flakes, or if you're a vegan, you instead of that you use some shiitake mushrooms. He figured out that in this soup, which is the basis of Japanese cuisine, is called dashi, soup stock, there's high levels of free glutamate. And that's what gives it this umai taste. It's what make it taste umai. So he coined the word umami, and now we know it's due to this component from proteins, the glutamate. And later it was discovered that in this fish product, which is part of the soup, there is high levels of this a nucleotide. And the most important observation was made a little earlier, a little later. That is, when these two things combine, you have a high synergy. It's called umami synergy. And the person in this room who knows most about that is down there, is Charlotte, and because she's done wonderful work on working out all sorts of combinations of foodstuff that can really bring the umami flavor in front. So now we are ready to have the tasting. So you out there, you're ready with your tomatoes or miso or soy sauce, and the rest of you here, you take a little piece. It's a piece of seaweed. It's actually a piece of this one up there, konbu. It's dried and then it has been simmered in soy sauce. And notice how small it is. And also notice when you put it on your palate and just suck on it and let it sit there and develop for a while. Just reflect on what's happening. There are things happening on the short time scale, and then there's something happening on the long time scale. That is toward the end of my talk. There's something lingering. And what is lingering there? And the same happening out there with now you have 150 tomatoes going on the palate, or maybe a little bit of miso, or maybe some sun-dried tomato. This is the signature of umami. It's very rich, mouth-filling, and it's lingering. It's there for a long time. And this is what the plants are missing. This is what you don't usually find in green stuff. And there's a poster here you can download from the web, where you can find all these different combinations. And if you think this is strange, combining seaweed and this fish or shiitake mushrooms in the dashi, it's exactly the same principle that works when you combine eggs and bacon, cheese and ham, tomatoes and beef and vegetables and meat in an ordinary Western soup stock. And Charlotte made some work recently where she actually, using this principle, came up with an explanation why champagne and oysters is a good pair. And there are many of these examples. So, so before I move on to give you the two possible solutions to how we can impart, in particular, umami to green, let me just, well, what I wanted to ask you, that is, whenever you have fast food and you like it, try to sort of analyze it in terms of umami. You'll find that there's simply jacked up umami. And that's why a dry bun or a terrible pasta or a dry pizza, they're all edible because it's actually lots of umami. But that's sort of something for an exercise for you to do. Now, you may say that, well, what about the spices? Because usually when we talk about making also green food, we spice them to give them sort of interesting flavors. But the thing is that spices have nothing to offer when it comes to taste. If anything, when it comes to taste, it's bitterness. And next time you eat spice, pinch your nose, and then you'll find out that spice is not very interesting. They're usually bitter. It's all their flavor impression is in the nose. It's aroma. So there's nothing to add in terms of umami. So what do? So we have to add sweetness, and there are obvious ways of doing that. I'll mostly talk about umami, but also come back to sweetness a little later. So that's the first route. So let's have a look at the first route. And what you can do here is basically what is well known in many cuisines, that you add it in terms of either dip or marinade or dressing. And the thing is that if you work these dressings and marinades with a lot of umami, you can basically get around without fat, if that's what you want. I'm nothing against fat, but you can have deliciousness without this sort of the oily, fatty feeling. And the most abundant and the most rich sources to get the missing umami, that is actually from the animal kingdom. So that's why in my subtitle, I also called my talk a kind of defense for flexitarianism, in the sense that you add in a little bit from the animal kingdom. So I would say, unless you have sort of religious reasons why not to eat animals, I would claim that we can get more people to eat more green if we borrow a little bit from the animal kingdom. It could be in terms of just minor aspects of meat. But then we have the algal kingdom, and you already talked about seaweed as one algae, but there are lots of other algae. And when it comes to seaweed, there are 10,000 different species. And some of them are actually very rich in umami. And then we can go to the fungus. And also the fungus, they're also very rich in umami compounds. And that's, of course, why many vegan cuisines use fungus to sort of spice up the vegetables. I myself are very interested in how we can use the sea as a source for umami contributions. And different reasons for that is, one is that we should really use the sea in a much more insightful manner. There are lots of organisms out there we do not use with insight. We use them to feed other animals, to feed other fish. But if you again go to the bottom of the web, there are lots of things here that actually have lots of umami. And if you just look at the scallop here and the seaweed, if you look in the reports that came out in Nature, there's a whole series of papers about a month ago about blue food. And you'll look at those foods that have the lowest impact on the climate and all the systems on the planet that are under stress now. There are two food agents on the very bottom, and one is farmed seaweed, and the other one is bivalves. That is mussels. For instance, think of blue mussels. They're by far the lowest impact on the climate. And that's, of course, they're on the very bottom. They only take photons from the sun and take whatever nutrients you got in the water. But all these organisms generally are loaded with umami compound. And whether it's free amino acids and small peptides. And I didn't say much about kukumi, but maybe I just say a few words about kukumi, which is a Japanese word that describes what is called kuku attributes to food, which is elicited by something like garlic, various kind of fermented products, but also seafood. And it's certainly small pieces of proteins, either di or tripeptides, that elicits this kukumi. And the kukumi has the effect that it can enhance other tastes, umami in particular, but also umami and sweet. So a little help from the sea will make it go a long way. And seaweeds is something I've been interested in together with colleagues for quite a number of years, and there are lots of them. And the thing is that they can be farmed in a sustainable fashion in the ocean. And this is something we also have to count in the green transition. Then also powerful things with fermenting things from the sea. A fish sauce is an example, which of course is used very much in Asian cuisines to make green food extremely delicious. But you could just, of course, you can ferment to provide umami flavor, all sorts of sauces that have a high in protein. And I flashed this slide because this is work we've done at the University of Copenhagen together with Michael and others, using either insects or game or pulses of different kinds. They're all very high in proteins, but no taste. So they need to be fermented, and there you can get all these powerful sauces as a condiment to the green. We've also in recent years worked on cephalopods. This is also work by Charlotte, who worked on cephalopods, in particular squid. In this part of the world, we don't eat much squid, but the waters are full of squid, and they actually, the populations are on the rise in contrast to fish populations. That's also an argument why to look for other alternative marine food sources. And they're very delicious, and there are ways to treat them without they getting rubbery. And if you analyze the taste compounds, you will find they're very high in umami and those compounds that gives umami acidity. So that's another source you can add. And there's a little bit of, say, a dried piece of squid, maybe marinate a little bit, can bring a green dish forward. A little help from the animal kingdom in terms of dairy. Those of you out there who found a Parmesan cheese to illustrate this umami, which the audience in here actually in the mouth because of the seaweed, you will find that cheeses, I mean, these hard cheeses, 8 cheeses, they're very high high in umami, and eggs for those who eat eggs as another wonderful source. So a little help from the animal kingdom. Then the second route, which I already talked a little bit about, that's fermentation, and that's the most powerful. And if you look to successful vegetarian cuisines and also vegan cuisines around the world, they are very much based on fermented products, either fermenting directly the main part of the dish, or fermenting a condiment that helps you to eat more green. And there is a number of microorganisms you can use for fermentation: bacteria, yeast, fungus, and also the enzymes of these organisms. And there's one that has been particularly successful in the Asian cuisines, which is now also moving into the West. That is the mold called Aspergillus oryzae, which is the one that is used to produce soy sauce and miso and sake as well. And it's a fungus that grows on rice, but it can also grow on other sources, all sorts of grains and pulses. And the wonderful thing about this mold is that it has enzymes that will cut up carbohydrates that have no taste into sugars, so it becomes sweet. Doesn't mean you get more calories, because the calories will be formed down in the stomach anyway, so why not get them up here? And the same thing with the proteins, they'll be cut up into amino acids, so it releases a lot of umami. And that's why, of course, that miso and soy sauce and sake, they're very high in umami. So I'll give you one recipe. It's very simple. Go to the shop where you can buy kodi or shiu kodi, where you can get basically the enzymatic solution in a brined liquid. Chop up your vegetables, put it in the plastic bag, toss in some of the shiu kodi, shake it a little bit, put it in the refrigerator, and then after a few hours, you have a different product. And after 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, it's extremely delicious. It's more sweet, it's much more umami. And the added benefit of adding in umami is that it cuts the top of the bitterness. And it's very prominent. I mean, no doubt, top of the bitterness is gone. This is, of course, also something people have found out a long time ago. In Japan and other parts of the world, in Asia, they have a whole series of condiments called tsukemono, which is different kinds of pickling. In Japan, they claim they have 4,000 different ways of doing it. And it's all a matter of adding to the vegetables the missing umami. So you can, in your refrigerator at home, have some of these vegetables that has been prepared in this way, either using this koji or been sitting in various marinades with lots of umami, and then you can easily bring them out and make something as tedious as kidney beans. You can buy very cheaply organic in a can for nothing, but it's not very flavorful, and it's mealy and it's dry. But if you add something in which has umami, and also in this case some crispness, it's a completely different thing. So that's the way to go. So I'm now giving you a recipe. Now it's time to finish, and I'll just present to you something here. Unfortunately, it's in Danish, but don't worry. The whole idea is that, and this is work I've been doing with a chef, a good friend of mine, Klaus Styrbeck, who's also part of and Taste for Life. Last year, we put out a quite large book on how one can make green more acceptable by working with these ideas I told you about, in particular umami and also kokumi. And we gave ourselves the task: can we design a shelf in the kitchen, just like you have a spice rack, and you take things down from the spice rack, different kinds of herbs, and you add it, but there's no umami there. Could we design a taste rack where you have different things on the taste rack which you can just take in and add to your food? So it's very easy, it's convenient. And we identified 80 different, I'm sure there are many more, and some of them are quite well known. It's no sort of big invention, but it was interesting for us to think about that. This is for the palate, that's for the tongue, whereas the spices, that's for the nose. And there you go, there are lots of them. So let me just finish on an optimistic note, that there is a way to get around the problem that plants in particular don't want to be eaten. And part of the cure is umami. So now we are in a school that works with education. So I'll end up with something I learned in Japan a couple of years ago, which has to do with children's education. And this is a rhyme, a nursery rhyme. Japanese children, they learn. So I'd like you to vocalize this rhyme together with me and those of you behind the screens as well. So let's go through it a couple of times and I'll demystify it. So it goes like this. Mako vayashashi. We have to do it again. Mako vayashashi. So this is what the Japanese children are told to remember. And why is that so? And that's because the syllables here for these different parts actually mean something. So ma is short for mame, which is bean. Go is short for goma, sesame. Va, short for wakame, that is a seaweed. Ya is yasai, vegetables. Sa for satana, fish. And shiitake, fungus, and I for imu, potatoes. And when you put this together and you say mago va yasa shi, it has a meaning, and it means grandchildren are nice. So that's the way that the Japanese children by childhood are sort of taught to think about what's important for the diet. And I couldn't help putting together this menu, which is sort of an outcome of the Eat Lancet report. It's called the global, it has a name, it's here, the Lancet Planetary Health Guide, which is something that came after the Eat Lancet report. And it sort of tells you what sort of, how should you put your plate together on the average of the different kinds of foods. And I can't help seeing that this modern plate is exactly what the children are taught in the traditional Japanese setting. So thank you very much for listening.